So I think we'll just go ahead and get started with the formal program. So thank you all for joining us for our Innovator in Residence. Jon is our first remote Innovator in Residence. So it's all just a glorious experiment in a techno residency. And I love that you're in Switzerland. So it's kind of like, how could this be any less like a residency? We'll physically bring him here usually for a block, but we're doing this extended over for a semester and he's not anywhere near us. So welcome to the pandemic age. But the Innovator in Residence program is something that creativity and innovation is really excited about. We bring people from all different disciplines to sometimes come to campus, and now in this new world, interact with the campus in a variety of ways. So Jon is a multimedia artist, a filmmaker, a sound and music producer, artist, photographer, digital art. I mean, the list sort of goes on and on. And in that way, he exemplifies what we are looking for in an Innovator in Residence. That we're looking for people whose practices bridge disciplines, complicate the boundaries between disciplines, really think about what creative process and creative inquiry looks like across perceived boundaries, and really looking at the ways in which an artistic practice or a creative practice can intersect with social, environmental, political concerns as well. So one of the questions that I'm always interested in this context is, what can art and an artistic practice, a film, or any kind of artistic creation bring into a conversation around something like environmental activism or climate change or social justice or any of those kinds of questions. So Jon is here for the semester, working with various classes, sharing his film, sharing his practice, and sharing his insight with all of us. Also today, we have Cindy Havison-Rourke. Cindy is an art historian whose work centers on artists of and in the Anthropocene. And she is working on a PhD dissertation at the moment on this topic. And so we're really excited to have Cindy here. Also encompasses environmental activism and research. So we're excited to have Cindy here today to act as a conversant and a respondent as we sort of dig into some of the questions that arise from this discussion. The PhD is from the University of the Arts and Creativity. I should say that just so that we can tell our program director that we said that. So what the format here is going to be is Jon is going to do just a quick presentation on some of the work that's kind of led up to or intersects with the themes of the film. And then we're going to jump into a conversation with Jon and Cindy. What I'd like to encourage everyone to do is if you have questions at any point, if you've brought a question to this session or something pops into your head, put it into the chat so that we capture all of these great questions. We'll also have time for you to jump in and raise your hand or just ask a question in a more organic way. But I do want to make sure that we're capturing the questions so that we can address them as we get into the conversation.
I guess the social areas that I'm interested in are healthcare, the environment, and technology. And that can take many different forms in terms of the technology I explore. I also work at the New York Times. They have an R&D lab, and we do a lot of 3D work and building 3D models. That's not something I'm necessarily going to talk about today. So I think something that we talked about briefly, I don't always introduce the film this way. I usually don't actually, but because this is a bit of an artist talk, I think it's interesting to throw this out there. I used to work as a kayak guide in Alaska, and in 2002, I guess it was 2003, I got in a really bad accident where a tree fell on top of me, and I was actually with two other kids from CC. And it was this pretty traumatic experience with this big rescue. There's a whole long article about it that you can read in the New York Times Magazine. But I think for me, the takeaway, or at least with some distance, is that, you know, I spent many years trying to be self-sufficient, to really pursue the outdoors, to really kind of embrace this level of independence and exploration. But when push came to shove, I was really happy to, you know, take in the comforts of, you know, what you know, a hospital offers, and what society offers, and that sort of that those contradictions and that desire to be self-sufficient, the desire to be able to kind of pick yourself up by your bootstraps and go out in the woods while still feeling this attachment to society, is something that I think I explore, or has become an important issue in my work, and just sort of recognizing that sort of fragility as well. And so I picked a couple of works that I thought I would sort of relate to that and relate to the film. This is a very early project. And again, this idea a little bit of inhospitability as well as pioneer species plants. And so that's something that, you know, for me, living in Alaska was really interesting to see on a natural level. You know, as glaciers retreat, these are the first plants that will inhabit this environment. And this is also the case, maybe not these specific species, but this phenomenon when there is a, you know, a toxic spill or a remediation happening where plants are trying to regain a foothold in an inhospitable environment. But this is just a computer program, and the computer program, when you hit play, it plants these seeds on the order of tens of thousands throughout your computer. And then you hit another button and it opens them up as you're seeing right now, and they become these, you know, full-fledged images or flowers of these pioneer species plants, and ultimately it fills your RAM and causes your computer to crash. And so it's this sort of test of like how dependent we are, this sort of playful thing of our dependence on the tools around us, and how far we're willing to sort of play around with some of these ideas. And so that's sort of a very digital software experience, but you know, that kind of led to me thinking about the more immediate environment. And, you know, having lived in Alaska for many years, I was now in grad school living in Brooklyn, and I've lived in Brooklyn for many years. I lived there for about 10 years before I moved up to Woodstock. And wanting to explore that, and you know, if we do live in the Anthropocene, if we do live in an era where pristine nature, you know, potentially doesn't exist, you know, what does that mean for the nature that does exist around us? Do we sort of need to reconsider where those lines are and how those things take shape? And so I began to look at my immediate environment in that regard, and did a whole series of projects. But this one in particular, I think, relates to the film, in that I took a map of Superfund sites in Brooklyn and used that as a way of navigating you know, the so-called wilderness of the area that I lived in. And so I did a backpacking trip starting at the south of Brooklyn, hiking all the way to Queens, just using this as a way of navigating rather than the traditional street map, and trying to draw parallels between those forms of existence. And it raised a lot of really interesting questions, obviously, of access, of private property, privilege, of course. But here's just a little clip that shows us camping out here. And so, did the audio go through on that? I wasn't, sometimes it doesn't always go through. Did you hear audio on that? No? Okay. But I think you got a sense of what it was. A lot of times in showing that video, the most important part is actually hearing the geese, because that's this reminder that in a way we were sort of having this this wilderness experience, even though it was in the middle of Brooklyn and that whole area. Those of you that have spent time in New York, that is now completely demolished and now is a very beautiful park, which again, sort of raises this question of like, is a beautiful manicured park a wilderness area? In a way, it felt that today feels less like a wilderness area than it did maybe at 12 years ago, whenever that was done. And so in beginning to sort of look at my environment and building tools or trying to understand my existence in it, I began to explore certain characters and tools. And this was a tool that I built using a hydrocarbon sensor, a microcontroller, and a metal detector to explore what at the time was the largest oil spill in North America. And it was a slow seeping spill underneath Greenpoint. And so this was sort of a DIY kit that allowed people to find this oil, and then in sort of a media spin allowed you to dig it up and get rich in theory to be able to sell that back to the black market. So to create the idea of some agency to the community, the idea that these finding and locating this was accessible, that there were some ways to understand this invisible fear that oftentimes wasn't seen except possibly in the summer when it would come seeping into people's basements. And then in a lot of my projects, there's a video component, there's a physicality part, and then there's sort of this, endurance is the wrong word, but actually the act of going out and doing something is really, really important for a lot of the projects I like to do. So I'll skip the video because you're not hearing the audio. Another project I wanted to talk about is Alviso's medicinal all salt. And this was an image that really stuck with me, which shows all the pharmaceuticals that are found in our water supply. Wastewater treatment plants in the US are generally pretty good. They were all built in the 1960s. And so while they do clean the water, they are unable to remove pharmaceuticals from the wastewater. And so through bioaccumulation, you're seeing that increasingly in shrimp and in fish. And so a water researcher and I wanted to figure out a way to bring awareness to this issue and to create a way of visualizing this a different way. And so we created this medicinal cure-all salt, which I'm going to jump a slide ahead just so you can kind of see how it works. Basically, we've mirrored this process that is really well known in San Francisco, where in the South Bay, you have these salt ponds, the water evaporates, and what you're left with is salt. And so we created the same system where we took water that comes out of the wastewater treatment plant, enters the South San Francisco Bay. We took that water, created salt evaporation ponds, and what you're left with is salt and all the pharmaceuticals that were left behind. And so we then bottled it as a medicinal cure-all salt that is sort of an aggregate of what Silicon Valley is taking to heal itself. And that includes a whole range of pharmaceuticals. You can see here erythromycin, fluoxetine, which is an antidepressant, caffeine, which is coffee, obviously, Ritalin, ibuprofen, albuterol, which is in inhalers. And then I've heard in other places, for example, Berlin, has a much higher concentration of cocaine in the water, and each city kind of has their own sort of mixture of pharmaceuticals in the water. And then again, for me, it's really important to kind of get out there to understand what's going on, to sort of have a connection to that particular environment. And there's sort of a rigor that is important in building these projects. As well as a video component that plays on these characters and kind of offers a sort of media spin to kind of offer a sort of a pop culture critique on our need to cure ourselves, our need for organic, and I guess we explored a lot of the language that you find in, say, a Whole Foods that is also true for something that we created, because it was hand harvested, it was organic. So just sort of making a nod at pseudoscience in that regard as well. This is a different project, but I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this. This is a bioremediation project that we made in the Netherlands. To get, to just sort of jump forward and talk about the film, the New Jersey Meadowlands is an area outside of New York City. as somebody that was relatively new to New York in the mid 2000s, I kept seeing this massive landscape that you really can only see from above. You can't see it. It's kind of invisible when you're driving through that area. And I became intrigued as to how a beautiful wetland like this could exist in such a large urban area and not have been developed. And it quickly became clear through folklore and through reading more about toxicity that this existed in part because it had been a dumping spot for waste facilities, but also Agent Orange. It also became really well known as a dumping spot for hitmen, and has a long history with Frank, what's his name? The famous mobster that was buried there. And yeah, so the first trip that I did there was an overnight trip, a 2-day trip over Thanksgiving, where we did a Thanksgiving feast looking at local foods. And so these are all the local foods that were manufactured in the area. So again, trying to understand the landscape and the food that's produced, because the original idea for the film, which is not how the film exists today, was to look at this area having been one of the largest artificial flavoring, or let me rephrase it, there are more artificial flavoring factories there than any other place in the world. And so the original impetus for this project was to do a sort of Marco Polo trip visiting all the artificial flavoring factories. And that was my entrance to exploring this, because I was interested in, like, if we that we're sort of like, our senses are an important way for us to understand and connect with our environment. And if we can't trust our senses, what can we trust? And so to me, it seemed like very interesting to look at artificial flavoring factories as an analogy for understanding the Anthropocene. The film then became something else that some of you may have seen. When we were out there, it became much, for me, what became much more valuable was the act of being out there, the act of understanding what it means to live in this landscape, and really to figure out what is of value here. And I think there is a lot of value. It is one of the more important migratory spots for wildlife. So even though it has this level of toxicity, it provides very important ecosystem services. And then over the course of the film, we meet a lot of these sort of low-level cues that we're seeing increasingly in climate change that are indicators that something is certainly changing in our environment. And so the film is, in some ways, I guess I don't necessarily need to give it away, but it's in part a lowbrow look as well as an experiential look at what it means to try to canoe and camp in this environment. And so I think I will probably leave it at that. This is a trailer here, but I think because there's no audio, I can just send out a link, and maybe some of you have already seen it. So cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what I think I'd like to do next is invite Cindy to maybe jump in here and maybe place this in a little bit of context in terms of what you're researching and thinking about as artists interact with the Anthropocene. And Cindy, you're still muted.
Done that. There we go. Okay. Hear me?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Jon, bravo to you to
Thank you.
take what would initially seem like an innocent canoe trip, and yet so fraught with dangers, both real, imagined, and maybe invisible. I think at one point in the film you say, yeah, I knew that we might run into some legal troubles, but in fact you did. And I came away with a lot of different thoughts about how your group sort of, through this experience, lived in sort of a liminal space between nature and civilization. And by that, I mean, the experience was ambiguous and disorienting. And through this kind of liminal state of body and mind, I think that is a very effective tool to reach the viewers. I mean, I know you did this journey for yourself, and clearly it's this first person narrative, but like most artists, I'm sure you are interested in its effect on the viewer, and you're trying to get a message out. You're trying to get, you're trying to be both passive in the sense of having a phenomenological approach to your journey, and yet at the same time, it's a very active form of engagement for your audience. So and by that, I mean, you mentioned the senses a few minutes ago. Echo cinema, which is what I'll call your film, and by the way, I'm not a film expert, I'm not a film critic, but it takes part in this movement called echo cinema, which has consciousness raising and activist intentions about issues and practices which affect planetary health. So, there's echo cinema, there's is one form of many media that reach out to people. But scientists and neurologists have discovered in lab studies that certain methods in art and film and music have ways of affecting people's senses. And I think you do that by, for example, when we're watching your group camp out, for me anyway, I could smell the unpleasant odors of the murky water and the fire and the marshy land. And we can see all those things, and our sense of touch is aroused with the rain and, the making of the food and the touching of the wetlands and the water as you go through it. We hear a lot in the film. We hear the helicopters, we hear the wind, we hear the radio warning when it says there may be flooding. We hear, actually, you introduce hearing as a very strong component right in the beginning when you get that phone call from the FBI agent. I think it was a really interesting juxtaposition with I think you hear the voice of the FBI agent, but you're showing at the same time this sludgy body of marshy water. And do that throughout the film. You sort of juxtapose sight, hearing, sound, taste, touch, all of it in a very low-key way for the most part. So nobody's getting hit over the head with any of these things. Like, there are other filmmakers who more like hit you over the head with it, very strong, dramatic images and really loud noises and really dramatic scenes. But you don't take that approach. You take this sort of very low-key, I think you call it cinema verite approach. So it's phenomenological in that the actors experience a situation viscerally as it unfolds. I'm calling your friends actors here. If we're going to call your film a work of art, I'm going to call them actors, even though they're not really actors. And very little is actually planned. So we experience events simultaneously with your friends. And that is what I mean by, for the students, that's what I mean by a phenomenological approach to an art form and in understanding. And what we also know from neurological research and the arts is that cognition does not have to only occur through the written word or through books or dictionaries or newspapers, but a kind of knowing, an embodied sort of knowing, comes from what your body experiences out in the world. It's like a mix of your feelings, your sensations, which affect emotions, and all of that interplays with events in the world, in the outside world. And so this is what they call embodied cognition. And I think your film allows both your group to experience that sort of understanding or knowledge, and it also allows the viewers to have that sort of new knowledge of this environment that you have. What word shall I use? This environment that you tread through lightly and cautiously. I'll stop there. There'll be more later, but.
Cool. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
I'd be curious, if the students found themselves feeling like they were riding along in the canoe, and if they felt themselves, and if their senses were engaged in the way that I've just described. Anybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
How do you all, feel? How would you feel in that canoe coming up against a toxic industry on one side and the marshland on the other side?
Yeah, I think the actual low budgetness and the kind of very like cinema verite, but also like it is not like the shiniest documentary I've ever seen. Like I think that actually really helps place you in this environment.
Cool. In the sense that like it's a little bit there's like a lot of movement, and in the same way that, well, there's that one film, what was that film, there was that horror film where you with the shaky camera. I'm trying to remember what that was.
You mean the Blair Witch Project?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Exactly. It feels like almost found footage, but it's better.
Cool.
If I may, I want to bring up the idea of landscape and space. And space is never neutral. It's interesting. You start out on a canoe journey, which should and could be an apolitical experience, right? Totally apolitical, just an enjoyment of wilderness. And what you learn, or you knew somewhat beforehand, but what we learn through the film is that space and landscape is just laden with layers and levels of human processes, power relations, social relations, politics, capitalism, conflict, industry. All of this is surrounding you as you paddle naively, down a river. So land is contentious. Land and water are extremely contentious things, and it's something to be thinking about for the students. I think, what does it mean when we get too close to nature these days? What do we find there? Can we cope? Are we alien to nature? Or are we part of nature? It's that old nature culture divide issue. Is there no binary between us and nature because it's all one planet? It's everybody's actions. All the consequences are for all, intended for all of us. You know, the future belongs to us, it belongs to nature. It's really all one cosmos. And our relationship to that cosmos is just fraught. It could be a very simple, loving, embracing thing, but unfortunately, we as human beings have helped turn it into a very fraught situation. And, you know, some philosophers say, oh, you know, Gaia, our Earth, Gaia is taking its revenge now on us. We've tampered too much and we're getting revenge now. And, you know, there are environmentalists, of course, that or philosophers or regular people that say, oh, COVID is Mother Nature's joke on us for not taking care of the planet. I mean, that's another way to go. You can look at this in a lot of different, you can take it in a lot of different directions. So, John, when you set out on the canoe trip, did you think that you might have these very fraught feelings about the journey?
I guess, well, how do you mean by fraught? In the sense, in terms of like feeling really exposed, or in terms of more conflicted, in terms of the purpose, etc.?
More like, did you anticipate a set of conflicted feelings as you paddled down?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I had those feelings kind of all along. I think that was partly why, for me, it was really important to kind of spend some really quality time there. And you know, one of the early premises, or one of the early sort of theories I had in shooting this film was that, you know, being out there for 10 days, that over the course of the trip, you know, the conversations would kind of hopefully get deeper and deeper, and we sort of begin to unravel some of these feelings or these ideas, and to some extent that did, not quite to the extent that I had anticipated. You know, I was sort of thinking of this originally as like a road movie, that like, or a road trip is maybe more accurate, where, you know, if you're driving across country, you know, the first day or two, you're really just kind of catching up with the person that you're with. There's a lot of pop culture jokes and references. And usually by day 3 or 4, you kind of begin to have, you know, the more deeper conversations, the more nuanced conversations once you've run out of conversation. And then that sort of progresses over time. And that was sort of why, everyone was mic'd throughout the whole trip. And so we had something like, I don't know what it was, 500 hours of audio to go through if you counted each individual microphone. And so that was originally how we were going to construct the narrative. That didn't exactly come to fruition in the way that I anticipated. And I think that is in part because that fraughtness is at times unnerving, and the best way to deal with your nerves is to talk about things that are comfortable. And so there was it was interesting to see, to go back to the footage. There isn't a whole lot of it in the movie, but to hear some of the juxtapositions when we're in areas that are fraught and potentially dangerous, to hear, you know, conversations about, you know, Seinfeld or whatever else was going, but that I think is like a human coping mechanism, you know, which I think was kind of endearing. But not necessarily about something to build a strong narrative about the philosophy of whatever, you know. But that's why, sorry to just add this one thing, which is in part why I added that scene at the campfire where we're having this sort of this crass conversation about disgust and dead hands and things like that, is because those were the conversations that we were having, and those I think are the ways that we can connect in sort of fraught environments.